Charlie, appreciate the invitation to join you here. Much has been said today about the current economic situation as it affects businesses and government. Many of you will know what our company, FICO, does. We're the credit scoring guys, so we think a lot about consumers. In fact, what we do is we help banks and other financial institutions understand the financial health of consumers, the American pocketbook, if you will. And viewed from either side of that relationship, the situation today is rather bleak. Although I'm an optimist by nature, there's a lot to not like about what we see out there today. Let's start with the banker's view of how consumers are doing. Every quarter we survey some 200 risk managers across the country. Through the early part of this year, they were very bullish. They saw the recovery happening, gaining steam. They were increasing their lending propensities. They were optimistic about American consumers winding down their debts. Something happened over this summer, however, and in our latest survey published last month, these 200 risk managers have turned decidedly bearish. They are very, very pessimistic about the near-term prospects in several areas of consumer finance. They see housing defaults growing, in fact, to the point where they don't see a housing recovery before the year 2020. It'll be the year 2020 before house prices get back to where they were before the recession. They see credit card defaults having tapered off for a while, beginning to grow again. They see auto lending and student lending going bad. And so the bankers don't feel good about the near-term prospects of their customers or of the economy as a whole. And that negative sentiment is echoed by consumers as well. Consumers actually, I think, can be described in 3 words these days: housing, jobs, and confidence. On the housing front, we saw just this morning that housing prices are down once again, 4% in the last month. That brings them down something on the order of 35% from pre-recession levels. And that means that fully a third of homes in the United States these days are underwater. And about a third of the foreclosures taking place are of underwater homes, people simply walking away from their homes because they have negative equity in their homes. When people feel so worried about the principal asset in their portfolio, they're disinclined to spend elsewhere. If my home is underwater, if I have negative equity, I'm not likely to undertake substantial debt obligations elsewhere. So housing is the first word. The second word is jobs. And of course, jobs and housing are linked. With unemployment running over 9%, and with the real rate of unemployment, when you include the disenfranchised and discouraged workers, running over 16%, closer to 17%, people are feeling skittish about their own employment prospects if indeed they have a job. So they're disinclined to buy houses and other substantial purchases. And this manifests itself in the third word. After housing and jobs comes confidence. We had a report this morning that consumer confidence is now as low as it was in March 2009, which was the depths of the Great Recession. So substantial indicators that we're sliding back towards some form of double dip. Now, what does this consumer view of the economy lead us to conclude about what's right for our country? I think it leads me to endorse at least 4 of the 6 policy points that David had. I do them in slightly different order, but essentially agree with the agenda that you had, David. The first thing I think that we need is some form of short-term stimulus. And there are 2 forms of it being discussed these days, both of which seem worthy. A jobs bill in some form, whether it's the one proposed by President Obama or some other way of getting people back to work. And that's part of your competitiveness agenda. And the other form of stimulus that we see being helpful is the one that's also being discussed these days around the housing industry, a restructuring of what the government has called the HARP program, the Home Affordable Refinance Program, trying to keep people in those underwater homes in their homes. So stimulus in the short term to avoid a double dip and ensure that we actually have a sustained recovery going on in this country. I come then second to the fact that that short-term stimulus does need to be offset by the long-term deficit and debt reduction that David was talking about. You did a nice job of personalizing things, taking big numbers and describe them in human terms. This deficit has another way of being described, since we talk a lot about housing. The service costs on the deficit these days can be described thusly for the American homeowner. You're actually paying for 2 mortgages. This is a CED calculation. The mortgage for the house you actually live in, and an equal amount in deficit service for the US government, of course, a home you don't get to live in. But you're paying 2 mortgages essentially for 1 house that you get to live in. So that's the monkey on our back. And that does call into need the deficit reduction programs as a long-term structural fix. Third, I do echo the sentiments around revising and simplifying the tax code. And fourth, this notion of entitlement reform, because those two things constitute what's underneath this confidence dilemma. When you ask consumers why they're lacking confidence, it's not just their worries about jobs and housing. They actually don't trust our politicians in Washington to get these structural fixes right. If we fix the tax code, which everybody knows is broken, if we fix entitlements reform, which people know needs fixing, I think that will go a long ways to addressing confidence. So the punchline is, from our perspective as the guys who look after how consumers' pocketbooks are faring, ample evidence that the consumers in America are looking for reform with short-term job stimulus and housing stimulus, long-term deficit reduction, and longer-term tax modification, simplification, and entitlement reform as well. So thanks very much.